one useful way that I found of thinking about these two Eliots is to think of the first one as kind of a Vatic poet, and to think of the later one as being a civic poet. Now, what I mean by these terms, Vatic and civic, is that Vatic suggests something of the prophet, something of the inspired, perhaps kind of romantic poet. Comes from the Latin word vates, and it points up certain aspects, I think is a good term, because it points up certain aspects of the earlier and more romantic Eliot. Suggests somebody a bit like the speaker, if you remember Coleridge's Kubla Khan. Weave a circle round him thrice, for he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. The idea of the inspired poet. The poet is somebody who's bringing you back secrets from beyond, has access to sort of secret knowledge. The kind of role of the poet that Yeats actually liked to portray himself as embodying. So this is the idea of the poet who presents himself as having access to strange secrets, which can only be uttered in cryptic and gnomic and obscure kind of ways. And there are definitely, if you think about it, there are definitely hints of that in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. The reference to Lazarus, for instance, from the New Testament, who will come back from the dead to tell us secrets from beyond the grave. It's true that the speaker of the poem, Prufrock, says that he is no Lazarus any more than he's kind of Prince Hamlet. No, I'm not Prince Hamlet, he says. But Lazarus and Hamlet do, in themselves, kind of as figures or as markers, embody a certain kind of impulse, a certain idea of the poet, I think. Somebody with access to more than ordinary human knowledge. You can hear the same impulse, I think, in the beginning of The Wasteland. April is the cruelest month. Why is April the cruelest month? I'm telling you, April is the cruelest month. Reading lilacs out of their back. It's that kind of voice. It's a confident voice. It's a voice that knows things, even if you're not quite clear exactly what those things are. But you hear that kind of voice all over early Eliot, I think. What are the roots that clutch? I should have been a pair of ragged claws. You know, this voice suddenly comes out with these statements. And they're of course not straightforward statements. Vatic poets don't speak straightforwardly about their experiences, but they can only urgently and perhaps desperately suggest what those experiences have been. Okay, so I think it's quite, if you play your mind over early Eliot, then I think you'll find this is quite a helpful kind of term, this term of Vatic. It does seem to cover quite a bit of the kind of imagined poet within the poems, if you like. Okay, so what about this term civic? Okay, so this also comes from a Latin term. It's related to words like citizen, and it comes from civis, which means a citizen. And the civic poet, as you might imagine, is rather in contrast to the Vatic poet. The civic poet will speak in a much more relaxed kind of manner, have a much stronger sense of an audience who's being addressed. A civic poet doesn't, like Prufrock, say, it's impossible to say just what I mean, because if you're a civic poet, then you're trying to find out what you mean. That's part of what you're doing. You're trying to be more explanatory. So civic poets tend, or somebody when they become a civic poet or has a civic poet side to them, they tend to feel that they've got something that, you know, kind of useful and potentially valuable to say about how to live. Vatic poets don't tell you how to live. They give you an impression of a kind of secret and intense life, but I'm not necessarily recommending that you should live that life yourself, or that you can. Whereas the civic poet is kind of, as it were, reaching out a hand to imagined reader. You know, try living like this. You know, these are the thoughts of things I've learnt. Maybe they could be helpful to you. So if the Vatic poet is essentially kind of romantic with a big R, which I think is true, the civic poet, on the other hand, is essentially classical with a capital C. And in fact, if you think about it, this is not that is not just something that one can apply to poetry or different kinds of poets. It's something that often happens to people in their ordinary kind of human lives. You know, that we start out romantic and we become more classical as we go on. That's not true for everybody, but it's true for a lot of people. That you start out kind of searching for kind of the secrets to life, and eventually you may come to a point where you think that not that you found them, but that you're on a slightly different kind of terms with life. You'll find it in other poets too, and I'll certainly bring up this idea again when I'm talking about Auden. Get on to the later Auden. Now, Four Quartets is equivalently the great later Eliot poem, as it were, in my terms, the great civic poem of Eliot's, just as The Wasteland is the great early Vatic Eliot poem. And Four Quartets, that's the name of the whole poem, is characterised in general by being poetically much more relaxed than The Wasteland. It's even chatty at times, and even explanatory. Nothing is explained in the early Eliot, and of course that's part of the point of that earlier work, and contributes to its intensity, the idea that things can't be explained, they can only be urgently kind of suggested or embodied in particular images or situations. In Four Quartets there are deliberately and consciously repeated themes, so you can sort of talk about themes. You can talk about themes with the earlier Eliot too, but the difference would be that in the later ones, clearly these are being much more calculatedly, deliberately played over. A bit quartets suggest music, and a bit like themes in music which keep returning. I think the thing about the earlier Eliot is that it feels much more involuntary. I don't mean that he didn't work over the early poems, but the impulse behind them seems more, much more involuntary. Each of the four quartets, so there are four of them, and these offer, I've stuck it up here, amongst other things, a series of meditations, and perhaps that's a kind of key term, that these poems are meditative, they reflect on things. And the things that they reflect on, some of which are certainly important to Eliot's early poems too, time, for instance, something that Eliot is absolutely obsessed with throughout his poetry. There will be time, says Prufrock, and time in various forms excuse me, is constantly kind of asserting itself or pressing on the early poems. But as you find in Four Quartets, there is time, and there's also timelessness, a rather different kind of idea. So that in the early poems, where it's, as it were, the poems and the people in the poems are being kind of pursued by time, are being hunted down by time, are trying to find time. Whereas in the later poems, there's a time perhaps with a capital T, also contains timeless moments, moments which are, as it were, outside of ordinary human time. Moments of kind of vision, moments of kind of mystical transformation, you know, part of, I suppose, a kind of religious faith. There are also reflections on history. History, of course, closely related to time in lots of ways. History being a sort of story of time, if you like. But also religious faith, old age. Eliot wasn't all that old when he wrote 4 quartets, but he felt old, seemed old to himself and to others. Also reflections on meditations on poetry and on language. I'll come back to these terms a little bit later on. Okay, now the dating of the poems is quite interesting, I think. Just useful to know. So the first one, Burnt Norton, was originally a self-contained poem. It wasn't part of a sequence. He didn't sit down and think, I'm going to write a sequence and it's called 4 quartets and the first one is going to be Burnt Norton. He wrote this poem called Burnt Norton. And it's a kind of spin-off from that play I mentioned, Murder in the Cathedral. Okay, so he had more material than he could use for Murder in the Cathedral, and he started kind of creating a poem out of that. And Burnt Norton, as I put here, is the last poem in his first collected poems. So he had a collected of poems that came out in 1936, and the last poem is called Burnt Norton. As sometimes happens when people do a collected poems, or I don't know, a kind of some sort of composite album or whatever, they will put a new direction at the end, or they'll put the latest thing that they've done at the end, hoping that it will point forward. And in this case, that's certainly true. But he didn't know that it was going to point forward when he originally wrote it and originally published it. So it was standing there as the sort of the latest item that I produced. He didn't write the second quartet, as you can see, East Coker. I didn't publish it until 1940. He didn't start writing it until after the Second World War had started in 1939. So there's a bit of a gap there. He started to see that he'd got a kind of model, that Burnt Norton offered him a kind of model for how he could do another one, East Coker. And then that becomes the model for the third one, Dry Salvages. So he starts to get a bit of a run going here. But he didn't start out like that. He didn't start out thinking, I've got a quartet. He started out, I've got an individual poem in 5 parts called Burnt Norton. And then when kind of came back to things at the beginning of the Second World War, that became the model. And then the fourth Little Gidding, there's Dry Salvages 41, that's the third one, Little Gidding in 42, and then they all come out as 4 quartets in 43. He published them individually. He was, you know, his own publisher. He was editor of Faber and Faber, could bring out his own poems, very useful position to be in. So these came out, East Coker, Dry Salvages, Little Gidding. Occasionally you come across copies, you know, of little solo albums, solo volumes, and then he collected them together. Okay, so why the names? Helpful to know the names, I think. So Burnt Norton, this celebrates a visit to friends near Oxford who lived in a village called Burnt Norton, and they had a walk round a rose garden. It's a rather different walk in the poem, but it came from an actual kind of visit to friends and an actual place. And in fact, all the places in the title are real. They really exist, and they all have a connection to Eliot. So East Coker, that's down in Somerset, and it's where T.S. Eliot's ancestors originally came from in the 17th century before they went to America. So it's a kind of point of origin. Dry Salvages, that's a group of rocks on the New England coast. Right at the beginning of talking about Eliot, I talked about how keen he was on sailing and the sea, and they used to go there. When he was a child, they used to go to the dry selvages. So those are the personal associations with the first three, and Little Gidding also has personal associations, and quite helpful to know about them. Little Gidding in the 17th century was the site of an Anglican community set up by a man called Nicholas Ferrer, and that was in the early 17th century. It's in Cambridgeshire, and Eliot went on a little pilgrimage, as it were, to Little Gidding in 1936 to see what was there now, to see the surviving kind of relics of the place. The overall title, Four Quartets, as I said, suggests musical analogies. Eliot was apparently thinking of calling the whole sequence Kensington Quartets, but he ended up calling them Four Quartets. Okay, now what I'm going to do next is a little kind of quick sketch map. I mean, I can't go through all of these poems individually, but I'm working towards going through a section of one of them a little bit later. But I think it's quite helpful to have a little kind of sketch map of what these poems contain. So that's what I'm going to quickly do. This will, of course, all be up on Blackboard for you. But they each have, they're each modelled on Burnt Norton, okay, which has 5 sections, as the Wasteland had, of course. And so Burnt Norton starts with a meditation on time. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past, it begins. And then from time in the abstract, as it were, time with a capital T, it moves into a moment in a rose garden, a moment of mystical joy in a rose garden. So from time to a timeless moment. Okay? And that's and it's done in this much more relaxed kind of way of writing, as you can tell. Time present and time past are both perhaps present and time future. It's verse, but it's much closer to a kind of sort of formal prose almost. So time and timeless moments, section 1. Then we get a short lyric in the second section. And also in the second section, another kind of meditation. So you're starting to get variety here. So short lyric followed by meditation on the idea of being outside of ordinary human time. Third section, Dark Night of the Soul. Scott Fitzgerald, whom Dylan referred to in one of the songs on Highway 61 we visited. You've gone through all of F. Scott Fitzgerald's books. I hope you've read some Fitzgerald, or do read some Fitzgerald. Wonderful writer, particularly The Great Gatsby, and The Crack Up, a brilliant story. He said that in the dark night of the soul, it's always 4 o'clock in the morning. But the dark night of the soul is particularly associated with Christian mysticism, as something that the Christian soul must work through the dark night of the soul. Then there's another lyric about mystical joy, and then another meditation. Okay, so there's a kind of oscillation between different kinds of language, different sorts of poetic language. Language working as lyric, highly charged, concentrated, compressed, highly rhythmical, and poetic language working in a flatter, more thoughtful, reflective, meditative kind of way. The last section, incidentally, of Burnt Norton is very famous. This meditation on language, very famous. So we start with words, and then we end up with the word, i.e. the Christian word. So it begins, words move, music moves, only in time, but that which is only living can only die. Words after speech reach into the silence, etc. And it goes on. The word in the desert is most attacked by voices of temptation. So we shift from words, part of language, with a small w, to the word, the sacred word, the religious word. Okay, so that sets the pattern, and with variations, that's the way that the other three parts of four quartets proceed. So East Coker, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through the first section in a minute. That starts with history this time, an idea of time, ordinary human history, again leading up to a timeless moment. Then there's a lyric. Okay, so you'll have noticed that section 2 starts, always begins with a lyric. Yes, that's true. And then that goes on to a meditation. So yeah, the lyric in East Coker, it's done as a kind of probably sort of sub Dylan Thomas kind of idiom, I would say. It ends up. Comets weep and Leonids fly, hunt the heavens and the plains, whirled in a vortex that shall bring the world to that destructive fire which burns before the ice cap rains. Certain sort of lyric voice there. And then we shift in the next section, and still in section 2, we shift to, that was a way of putting it, not very satisfactory, a periphrastic study. So we'll comment on what you've just been reading. So the poetry will kind of reflect on itself. And reflect on the nature of language, the nature of utterance, what you can say, what you can't say. And, as I put up here, reflect on knowledge. You know, how do we gain knowledge? We gain knowledge partly perhaps through coming to lectures, but by experience. Things happen to us, and so we think that, we feel that we know something as a result of those. But Eliot is sort of comparing that kind of knowledge to what he calls wisdom. The only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. Humility is endless in the sense that it goes on infinitely, but it doesn't have an end in sight. So there's a kind of pun on endless. It doesn't have an end in a double sense. Third section, so that was Dark Night. That was Dark Night of the Soul there. Now it's kind of the darkness of death, ordinary human experience of darkness. That's set again against this idea of the dark night of the soul. Then there's another lyric, and then there's another meditation about words and writing, sense of personal failure. The need to keep exploring, that you've got to keep pushing yourself. You can't just repeat what you've done as a poet, but you can't either also just repeat your life experiences. You have to keep pushing, you have to keep exploring. Old men should be explorers. Dry Ages. Okay, this time we start with, again, it's time, so time tends to dominate the opening section of each of these quartets, but here we have the images of the river and the sea, and they're offered as sort of different ideas of time, or representing different ideas of time. Quite a traditional idea of that, but worked in a rather different way here. Again, second section we go into something, into lyric, here a kind of lyrical prayer. And then we shift again in the second part of section 2 to a meditation. Here, a meditation again about experience, particularly this terrific line, I think, we had the experience but missed the meaning. Don't have to be religious to think that that's actually a pretty interesting line, quite a wise line that we often feel in our lives, that things have happened to us, but we didn't get what they were at the time. Maybe with hindsight we might come to understand them a bit better, but something happened to us. Maybe we thought we knew what it was at the time, but we didn't actually. Eliot's, of course, talking, this is a Christian poem, he's talking, about religious experience, particularly, I think, but a lot of this applies whether you happen to share the belief system or not. Third section, we're back with exploration. So you can see how the same kinds of ideas keep circling around, keep being looked at in different kinds of ways. Then there's a lyric to the Virgin Mary. If you're High Church Anglican, i.e. quite close to Catholicism, then the Virgin Mary has a particular kind of status for you. Wouldn't be true if you were more low church. But she's obviously, if you are Catholic, for instance, very key figure, and if you're Anglo-Catholic, like Eliot, pretty key. Then again, a meditation, kind of about knowledge and wisdom. Okay, the last one. So here we have, we begin with a description of, as it were, midwinter spring, or what he describes as midwinter spring, which of course is a kind of paradox. You can't actually have spring in the middle of winter. But that's used in the poem as a kind of emblem for, I think, kind of mystical revelation in the midst of kind of the winter of life, metaphorically speaking. But this picks us up to a description of, based on Eliot going to Little Gidding in the mid-1930s, so he's recreating his experience of physically going somewhere. So, I'll say this again later, but one of the things about these poems is that, unlike the early poems, the journeys do have destinations. The early poems in Eliot are full of people wanting to make journeys, starting to make journeys, thinking about journeys, but nobody ever gets anywhere. Here, you actually get somewhere. If you set out to go to Little Gidding, you do get there. It might not be what you thought, but you do get there. Then the lyric, in this case, it's the four elements, air, earth, water, and fire. And there's a wonderful section, I haven't got time to read it to you, I'm afraid, but it's a wonderful section, section 2, after the lyric in Little Gidding, about a meeting with a familiar compound ghost, a very famous section from this poem, well worth having a look at. The compound ghost, compound, so made up of different elements. It's partly Ezra Pound, it's partly Dante. Ezra Pound is still alive, of course, when he's writing this. It's partly Dante, partly Mallarmé. It's made up of the figures that Eliot felt had kind of influenced him or made a difference to his life. And it's a brilliant encounter. And again, as an encounter, it's actually quite spacious. There are plenty of encounters in the early poems, but they're very cryptic and they're very short, and you don't know what happened exactly, except perhaps in Portrait of a Lady. Whereas here, it's a much more extended encounter. There's a kind of conversation. Then there's a meditation in section 3 on attachment, detachment, and indifference to faith. Very important if you're a Christian. Lyric about the Holy Ghost and love. Holy Ghost, of course, key player. And then the last section sort of pulls together the themes and images of Little Gidding, but also of the sequence as a whole. So you can see a pretty ambitious kind of poem. Okay, so I'll just make a few sort of general observations to kind of pull that together. So Burnt Norton, the first one, that gives the general shape, the 5-part structure to the poems. But to repeat, he didn't see it as the beginning of a sequence. He thought of it initially as a standalone poem. You have noticed that the first part of each second section, that's a lyric, as is the fourth section. And this lends variety of styles, variety of tones of voice, variety of ways of expressing things. So it's not all just in one kind of house style that is pursued all the way through the poem. And section 5, in most of the poem, in all the poems, sort of pulls together the first 4 sections and is normally in some way or other about language. Eliot kind of created a new kind of meditative poetry with 4 quartets. That doesn't mean to say that people hadn't written meditative poems before. Of course they had. But this was a kind of, at the time and since, has felt like a different way of approaching writing this, what I've called civic, but meditative poetry. And one voice modulates in the poem into another. So you don't get these abrupt juxtapositions that you get in the wasteland. You like, in some pieces of music at least, you get a kind of shift, a nice harmonious kind of shift from one moment to another. Or occasionally you get something a little bit brisker, but you get nothing as deliberately jarring, dissonant as you get in the earlier work. Part of the greatness of the earlier work, I think. There are, as I say, preoccupations in common with the earlier poetry, but they're treated differently here. So memory, very important, but treated differently from memory in the early poetry. Time, very important, again, treated differently though. Now, one of the things about Eliot is that he was, of course poets have always thought about language. Poets have always reflected, normally in glancing, if they do at all, on the language that they're using in poems. So poems have been self-reflective for a long time. That the language of Shakespeare is often very self-reflective. That's not a modern phenomenon. But to use the language that you're using as the subject, sort of central subject, now that was unusual. So to prioritize language as a key element in what you're writing, that was different. Particularly in a poem in which you keep coming back to it. I think I want to say that this poem isn't, although it is a Christian poem, isn't a self-satisfied or self-congratulatory poem. Obviously, having a faith both kind of in his real life, as it were, and in his literary life made a big difference to Eliot. But it's not as though it sorted everything out. So the poems are still exploring things there. To read them is a bit like overhearing or feeling that you're overhearing somebody thinking aloud. I don't, of course, mean he didn't work on the poems, that this was the first version that he kept. But it does at least have the illusion of thinking through things and having to return to them to think again about them. So it's not that everything is neatly tied up here. That's, I think, a very important kind of thing to say. And I think they do definitely have things to offer, even if you don't happen to share the belief system of the poems. I'm a pious agnostic myself, but I think this is a wonderful poem. I think by pious agnostic, I mean I think that a lot of the Christian rules are good, but I don't think you get rewarded for it. Okay. But I think this is a fantastically rewarding poem. So I don't share the belief system of it, but I think it's fantastically rewarding to read. And I've known this poem since I was your age, and it stayed with me in a very powerful way. Okay, and there are undeniably some flat bits. It has to be said. I think Donald Davy, the critic, was the first person to point this out. And particularly Try Salvages has got some flat bits. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the beginning of East Coca. Okay, so this is the second of the 4 quartets. And I'm just going to read and talk through the first section just to give you an idea of what's on offer here. Okay, so if you've got a copy, you can follow, but I'll be reading it to you if you haven't. So, starts with first paragraph. In my beginning is my end. In succession, houses rise and fall, crumble or extended, are removed, destroyed, restored, or in their place is an open field or a factory or a bypass. Old stone to new building, old timber to new fires, old fires to ashes and ashes to the earth, which is already flesh, fur and feces. Bone of man and beast, cornstalk and leaf. Houses live and die. There is a time for building and a time for living and for generation, and a time for the wind to break the loosened pane and to shake the wainscot where the field mouse trots, and to shake the tattered arras woven with a silent motto. Okay, so begins, in my beginning is my end, and Eliot's ancestors came from the East Caucasus, so there's a personal dimension to that. In my beginning is my end. And this opening section is going to describe actually going to East Caucasus. So to go back to where your ancestors came from is, you know, kind of return to a point of origin, to return to a beginning. It's also, I should say, he talks about a tattered arras. In my beginning is my end is a reversal of Mary Queen of Scots' motto, in my end is my beginning. So he's kind of playing with a historical kind of tag at the same time. He's also here talking about houses in a kind of double sense. So houses rise and fall. Historically, that can also refer to kind of families as houses, the House of Lancaster, the House of York, as well as kind of physical dwellings. So houses rise and fall, crumble or extended, are removed, destroyed, restored, or in their place, and this is a brilliant line, this I think, is an open field or a factory or a bypass. And that line is a brilliant kind of zoom through history. Okay, so you start with open field, then you get factory, then you get bypass. So you go, if you like, from earlier historical time to the Industrial Revolution, factory, to modern world, bypass. So just in one line, you kind of zip through history. Brilliant, I think. But he's also talking about history as a kind of cyclical process. So things rise and they fall. Yeats talks about this too, of course, in Lapis Lazuli. So things rise and they fall, so old stone to new buildings, old timber to new fires, old fires to ashes. So things go round in a kind of circular pattern. So you can, if you see time as history, see it as a kind of cyclical process. That's one way. So this is not being offered as the answer, but it's being offered as one way of thinking about things. He's also, in the background, got an idea of the bit of there is a season, turn, the bit of Ecclesiastic made famous by the birds. But you'll notice that this has got the phrase, there is a time. Now that's very different from proof rock. In proof rock, there will be time. Everything is deferred to a kind of future. But here, there is a time. Very different. Then, okay, so that's the first little kind of paragraph. Then it goes on, but it returns, and this is a bit like proof rock too. In my beginning is my end. So we get the same, so we get a new start, as it were. Very typical of Eliot. So start, stop, start again. In my beginning is my end. And now he's going to describe going to East Caucasus. Now the light falls across the open field, so there still are open fields, leaving the deep lane shuttered with branches dark in the afternoon, where you lean against a bank while a van passes. People often commented on how exact that is, that there's, as you're coming into East Caucasus, you do have to lean against a hedge if anything else is coming.
and the deep lane insists on the direction into the village, in the electric heat, hypnotized. In a warm haze, the sultry light is absorbed, not refracted by grey stone. The daily asleep in the empty silence wait for the early owl. Okay, so the first paragraph is a kind of general reflection about history and cycles on a sort of personal level, but also on a kind of genealogical and larger political level. But here we begin again and we go on an actual journey which takes us to East Coker, and is going to take us to an open field. That phrase keeps cropping up in this opening section, and we're going to see something. In that open field, if you do not come too close, so here we are in East Coker, and it's a kind of imagined, recreated moment from the past. So here there is the idea that imaginatively, at least, the past can be recovered. We can get access to the past. The past is not just shut off from us. That memory is a problem. Actually, memory, personal memory, and cultural memory, these are good things. These are things that imaginatively connect us to worlds, including the past, outside of ourselves. In that open field, if you do not come too close, on a summer midnight, you can hear the music of the weak pipe and the little drum, and see them dancing around the bonfire. So we're back in a kind of historical, recreated historical moment here. A bit like being in a historical novel, perhaps. See them dancing around the bonfire, the association of man and woman in dancing, and the language here, the spelling, goes into old kind of speak. So we know that we're in a kind of earlier period. So it's written dancing, D-A-U-N-S-I-N-G-E. In dancing, signifying matrimony, a dignified and commodious sacrament. Two and two, necessary conjunction, holding each other, each is spelled E-C-H-E, other by the hand or the arm, which betokeneth concord. Round and round the fire, leaping through the flames, or joined in circles, rustically solemn, or in rustic laughter, lifting heavy feet in clumsy shoes, earth feet, lone feet, lifted in country mirth, mirth of those long since under earth. So we know that they're all actually dead. What we're seeing is a kind of ghostly recreation of a scene. Nourishing the corn. Keeping time, so a different idea of time here, keeping time, keeping the rhythm in their dancing as in their living and the living seasons. The time of the seasons and the constellations, the time of milking and the time of harvest, the time of the coupling of man and woman and that of beasts. Feet rising and falling, eating and drinking, dung and death. Quite incantatory as that moves on, isn't it? But kind of recreating this idea that, or at least the desire for a kind of organic society, I think, where things seem to be properly integrated. All the aspects of life were properly integrated together, not kind of sort of separated and divorced and juxtaposed and jarring. Then there's a very short little coda to this opening section. So we've had this, as it were, kind of timeless moment, but we know that it's a kind of self-consciously created one. I think that's why Eliot has preserved the old-fashioned spelling, because I mean he knows that he's sort of made it up, but it still expresses a desire for something. Something perhaps lacking, something which is desirable and should be reconnected with. The idea of dancing, as I'm sure you remember from Shakespeare comedies end with a dance because the idea of the dance was that everybody had their place in the dance, that it wasn't a solipsistic solo exhibition of yourself. It relied on you knowing the steps and the people you were dancing with also knowing the steps. So you were part of it was a little miniature of a unified action in which people trusted and relied on other people's kind of shared knowledge and shared activity. So, you know, very appropriate at the end of a comedy to bring everybody together into a dance. You'd never end a tragedy with a dance because everybody's dead. You know, so they can't dance anymore. But at the end of a comedy, it's kind of sort of light-hearted moment. So he's kind of playing on that kind of idea here, the idea of witnessing this country dancing, this moment of country dancing in the midnight. But then we break off and we go into a quite different, we've had this kind of incantatory, biblical kind of cadence, but the poem then kind of switches for the last 4 lines of just part 1 of East Coker. Dawn points, much more contemporary. Dawn points, and another day prepares for heat and silence. So you're pulling back from this moment of imaginative participation, pulling back to actually what most days are like. So pulling out of the timeless moment. Another day prepares for heat and silence. Out at sea, the dawn wind wrinkles and slides. I'm here, or there, or elsewhere, in my beginning. So I'm here, as it were, writing this poem. I'm back in that kind of moment that I've just been creating, but where am I? I'm dispersed, you know. There is, we kind of decide, you know, you're here, but in your heads, you're also thinking about the fact that it's going to finish in 1 minute, where you have to go to. You're also thinking about that conversation that you had with somebody. You're thinking about who you're going to meet later, or, you know. So we are always here, but also elsewhere, aren't we? Very, very cleverly catches everything. And then we have just the beginning, in my beginning, which takes us back to the beginning of this section, but is almost like a kind of another start. Okay, so each start presupposes within it a new start, a new kind of beginning. Okay, that just gives you a little taste of what these poems are like. So good luck with them. Good luck with your essays, of course, which we're going to look forward to seeing a little bit further